another week and a half, we have the same come out.
You further ahead than you were 8 hours ago.
You got a process. You got with one bifurcation. And Sweetwater, doing ethanol fermentation correctly, or we take it to 67 degrees.
I heard you ask my question was answered. That was one size trial.
Oh, yeah, that's my question.
Because all this thing about leakage gauge and recording the flow is
So, you know, the way you want to do this is say, you can flip a coin and say, I want to do it in a 48-foot container, a 53-foot container. Okay, so if I'm going to build a piece of equipment and put on a truck, it's got to fit, you know, inside that container. That's going to be the string that doesn't have a fit inside. That's the end.
because you're real slow at speed up.
Right, just go home lunch.
Exactly.
But so that's my question. You know, can you pull a 53-foot container truck onto the farm? It sounds like most of the time the answer is yes. There's going to be some snow. Some what's over here.
How you doing?
But so the question is if we're going to fabricate.
Pretty good. I know. I spent my whole life learning how to dig. This seemed old.
And one of you gets set up. Yeah, and that may be part of
That's what I mean. It's my
right now.
I'm skipping.
Be able to pretty large whole shipments in their distribution.
Trucks and back together. Flexible pipe connectors.
They said about it.
I don't have
Yeah, what's available and get built.
Where's it going? I don't think that's how it's going.
I think so. Not expensive, but it's to me, you're buying it for
I don't think it's going to be. I guess it's because I don't know these steam glass.
well, okay, but don't forget, we need gas tank. Metering valves for that. We need boiler. Now, you just buy that, right? That's all comes in package. It's got to be done.
You're not worried about that.
Not in the pharmaceutical industry. I used to worry that
part of the pharmaceutical
process development. Sure. Well, seduced away by this nice state New York. I still did well in the problem. So, but that was, we were fermentation and bioprocess development. That was the big fermentation. So that was 27 years, which actually today is tiny. Citric acid last year. That was the last penicillin production facility. All
listening to you today and some of the others, it sounds like what I would say, I look at the execution. Some of the big decisions that we're gonna go in this direction for you. Now you're working through execution. How are we gonna execute?
So the decision that got made was that there's a problem with the service grows. No one wants to do the food side of it. Dairy, dairy or cattle, it's kind of, well, it's the backstop. That,
Make up two days.
well, you don't lose your land, but that's about it. So what do you do? The decision to do something. That's when I got here.
That was the teaching.
That was something
So you're executing the things that you're discussing. You've got some funding. You're executing. You're trying to figure out how to allocate those resources.
a plan that says this can be done just like this. You're
Not executing the plan.
today, right, as far as I'm aware. Well, Ben has some, there's money today. Exactly how much, I don't know. I get no expenses.
Trying to get back to the plan right now.
Something like that. Well, you know, it's good for that one. It's good. Always look around and see what else is out there. Why not? Just curious.
I do have to give me an idea. I'll send it to you. All right. Those
It's not quite there. It would have been easy.
we don't have to yet. The big part of it is, the biggest part of it is, everybody's got to control it. So, safety.
All we need is one
Certification
That's
process.
it.
See, the FAA has nothing to do with certifying. They don't certify you. But they do, type certify jet engines, aircraft, airplanes, what components of an airplane. Type certification process. Considerably. Jet certification. So, it's out there. What's going on, how we facilitate the process to make sure that it's being burned in the jet engines today, still keeps those jet engines.
Which is volunteer.
Yeah, I've been involved in delivery. And I think it's voluntary. Part of it is keep people involved in business. The dynamics of the business change based on regulations. They're actively involved because they want to be involved.
There is a self.
And once use people ASTM process is just a piece of testing. Then it's a guarantee they're consistently tested. Production. And the only piece of equipment today it's acceptable. Just protect the brand. And there may be parts that go into it that are screws or something that are expendable.
Well, misbalances are so standard.
There's a last two today, somebody else had been for years, mandating something like that in car, truck, to the ground. This thing stutters and goes off to the side of the road. These things can't stutter and fall out of the air. No activity in the way. Society inserts this issue level. We have advancement. See that? Well, we try to get beyond this is exceptions. So any mechanism that's out there that can counteract typically warming trend.
They wean and cycle.
I wasn't around.
So I can describe the process.
Maybe we put things we just like we're going to develop a clean it, chip it, using, and then you clean
Well, got a size.
Okay, 500.
Go to certain locations.
Standard
It's 3:07. We're going to reconvene in 3 minutes. So anybody wants to, we're going to be at 3:10. We're going to try and get the whole group and wrap it up here. We're ahead of schedule, so be back in a few minutes. No, you're. Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Can I have your attention? If we could reconvene here, we'd like to get into our wrap-up session. While we're waiting for everybody to get seated, I do want to remind you of our Farm to Fly no-host dinner. There's a one-page pickup on the table under the whiteboard to the back of the room there on the way out. The no-host dinner is at Cobb's Landing, 200 North Indian River Drive, Fort Pierce. I think we went there in our January meeting, and there's a phone number, and it is currently 3:15. We hope to reconvene there at 5:30 tonight. Any problems getting to the restaurant, you can call me. My cell number's on the paper, but as you go out, you could pick up, there are not directions, but this North Indian River Drive is about 5 miles to the east. If you just, you put in the 200 North Indian Drive in your Google, that's probably the safest thing. So if anybody has any questions, give me a call. With that, I thought we could ask Rich to tell us where his group, what were the what challenges, the key challenges and the actions, and any changes he might have. Rich?
Works. Good. So we discussed on the agenda sheet items 2, policy and regulatory barriers, and then also the sustainability and NGL evaluation. Fundamentally, the 5 items that we put down in the approaches in broad terms were accepted by our working group as being pertinent. We did get into some additional coaching and helping on strategies of those, but the one thing I wanted to do, and I wanted to invite Dave Meyer up here, we did come up with an additional element that affects the economics of the regulatory policy, and Dave will grab a seat here and explain it to you what the thought is, and we want to add that then to the list as important.
All right, thanks. I wasn't expecting to be
told
front and center.
yeah.
But, yeah, so one of the discussion points that we had was just making sure that the regulatory framework that we have that provides different incentives for the production of different kinds of fuel essentially adequately recognizes the value of sustainable jet fuel. And a couple of key points there. One is that the low carbon fuel standard in California currently does not recognize jet fuel as at least under that regulatory system. There is an effort to get jet fuel included under the standard, but currently it is not. So that presents a challenge in that there's significant additional value that can be recognized for ethanol under that standard as opposed to when it's converted into jet fuel. And then there's also just a little bit of a challenge even under the renewable fuel standard because of the fact that you're essentially converting 2 gallons of
ethanol into 1 gallon of jet fuel, there is some loss of value there from a RIN perspective that needs to be addressed. So it's just making sure that the regulatory incentives are aligned to incentivize the production of jet fuel, which is something that we all know, as was mentioned earlier. Jets aren't going to stop flying on liquid fuels anytime soon. We need to make sure that the liquid fuels that are produced are properly recognized for their contributions.
Yeah, and we need to phrase that in what's pertinent to the Florida situation, and I was discussing this with Ed Fielding here a little bit. You want to be in a situation, growers will be happy if their ethanol is bought and sold somewhere other than the state of Florida. So, for example, if you ship ethanol off to California, you get a better deal in terms of the benefits, in terms of producing end products under the California Air Force Air Resources Board regulations. The problem with that is that you sub-optimize the total benefit for the state of Florida. So Florida airports don't benefit from fuel going into their situation, which we could produce with alcohols shipped off to Sopperton, Georgia, potentially, and converted to jet fuel there and then shipped back to the airports where they would be produced here. So the thing that we need to look at from a state perspective is the policies that would allow you to incentivize keeping your fuel in Florida. There's been a lot of criticism of things like wood pellets for similar reasons. Yeah, we grow them and then we don't get any benefit from them. They end up going to Europe. So I think that's a discussion that we need to have at the state level. And we brought this up with Mike as well. So we need to add a challenge relative to the incentives to keep fuel instant and also get maximum benefit. In general, it works okay with jet. But in the case of ATJ, where you would need 2 gallons of ethanol to make 1 gallon of jet fuel, that math doesn't work for you necessarily. Most of the rest of what we discussed were mostly tactics on the front end. And there, I think I was going to do this, but I think it's worth mentioning a couple of them. Mike Adams, who was with us, mentioned we rued the lack of the engagement of the local NGOs in the process. So the thought process was that we may be attacking this the wrong way, that trying to get the local groups to come out to fight the next development is maybe the wrong approach. That what you want is, and he mentioned 2 groups, Harbor Branch and ORCA, which is not the whale. It's the Ocean Research Conservation Association. So potentially, say you go with surrogates and try to get them involved in the next meeting, which I guess Harbor Branch was involved originally, or the local folks are. So you get the people who are respected for their work by the local folks. The local folks, if presuming that they don't engage, they would accept analysis or approaches from them. So that really goes with the securing stakeholders question. And Mike had given that some thought, and I think we ought to pursue that. The other things were actually strategies and tactics for our other work. And on the procurement effort, and we discussed the work that Tom's done and the whole BEAT certification piece at the ground level and at the crop level. But the point that you made, Dave, was that the fuel that eventually comes from that there really are 2 pieces. Ultimately, certification would have to cover both processing and the side of making the fuel. And that particular issue, it would appear that ethanol being ethanol, you could pursue that part under RSB, which they seem to accept, with whom the airlines would accept that outcome. I think EPA would. So if you get your part done on with the crops themselves, coupling that with an RSB activity, which could be acceptable to the Sharon Lees of the world, and we should test that at our meeting, assuming Sharon will be there, and I think she might very well be there at this meeting, so that becomes a meeting that we want to have. The other discussion we had was how do you attract veto? The DOE people who have not engaged so far because sugar is a crop that they don't want to deal with in the Title I provision. So we got an elaboration on the discussion we had this morning with the Toronto family here. And the thought process was, and I think I got a better understanding of what you were talking about relative to the content, the sugar content, and sucrose versus glucose versus plus fructose, that we shouldn't need markers. You know the chemical content of what's coming out of the crop, and the question we need to take up with Harry Baumas and the guy who raised that flag highest is, why doesn't that tell you everything you need to know? And if it doesn't, what do we need in terms of additional? Somebody's getting a music play. Is that you? Everybody's looking at their phones. So no, it's not me. It's somebody else. So we have a couple of missions that we want to take up next week. One of the other issues, and I think Dave's going to be at the meeting next week, along with David and yourself and myself, and we'll have our meeting with DOE. And the argument, and I finally got the spelling right, azeotropic, which is a purity question on ethanol. So what we want to do is convince them that they really do want to, as part of their working with Logitech, they want to expand the purity, I'll call it the purity level of the alcohol that they work with. Whereas they're currently working with a 99% purity level, the alcohols we get here are going to be less than that, whether we should make sure they're a little bit less than that, and then say this is not an issue of what sugars came from. It's an issue of whether you can expand the purity spec. And by the way, we can get that alcohol to allow you to expand the purity spec. Why is that a problem? Or that can work, right? If it doesn't work, then we got a policy argument. And that discussion, I think, is very frequently people will work process issues with something less than the absolute, the real feedstock they want, because quite frankly, they can't get it in quantities at the purity level that they want. So I think this creates an opportunity for us to set up a meeting with DOE staff now. If DOE staff says, gee, I don't know who my boss is, so I can't make any commitments, and I won't know for 6 months, which is probably what's going to happen, is then we've got the case for the transition teams to work on, to the degree that Ed, you or Mike or somebody knows somebody who's going to be working transition, then that gives us a case. So I think we have not just this new task that was mentioned, but Dave's going to give us a little paragraph that we can, here's the problem and the path to resolution, but we also have some tactics that we want to follow, and I think it was productive discussion in that sense. So thank you all. Thank you, Dave. It's very impromptu coming up here.
No problem.
I'll turn it over to Dave.
Thanks for having me. I'll leave the stage to you.
Yeah.
So, great job, Rich. Great job. Thanks to your group for the hard work you put in on that. Our group talked about the production economics, and we had 3 key challenges. One was making sure that the new sugar feedstocks are produced will be price competitive at scale. The other was identifying current efforts to facilitate the project development plan and timeline. And the third was being able to ensure these crops, these biofuel crops at levels equivalent to food crops. So with that, David, if you could kind of summarize the group's conclusions.
Sure. We made some process decisions, which was the main event. So we're targeting 500 acres. At 40 tons an acre, that's 20,000 tons of raw beets. And that would be processed somewhere between, at a rate of somewhere between 120, maybe 150 tons per hour, as that's what the equipment size is, harvesting equipment size is. Whether we can put together equipment that'll allow that to operate for a full 8 hours at a stretch, or we have to run it for 4 hours and catch up, we'll find out. The process that we decided on, if you remember back to the slide that I showed you this morning, harvest the beet, there'll be a washing step, chopping, milling, and then into the hot tube reactor that Randy told you about with the resin cyme and into a flash tank. After that, the decision has been made, we are going to separate the solids material. The undissolved material, the dissolved sugars, will remain in the aqueous stream, the liquid stream. The solids will be pressed, hopefully to something less than 60% moisture. And those will go off for feed, for pelletizing to cattle feed. And this should give us a very dense, caloric, high-value pellet that can be used stored and used all year round. Running the wet pulp right into silage is problematic. No one knows in this particular climate, Florida, South Florida is different than North Florida, if that is something that can be done, even though we know it is done today up in Michigan. But what works in Michigan won't work down necessarily in this agricultural climate zone. The energy requirements for the, specifically for the steam explosion, we're going to take a look at those. We don't want to get ourselves into something that's just so energetically expensive that it doesn't make sense and would fail an LCA test for RIN certification. We're going to make an estimate of the OPEX at 500,000, 500,000 gallons of diesel, 3 million gallons, 10 million gallons, and 50 to 100 million gallons. The output of the process, excuse me, I got ahead of myself. In addition to the solid material, the liquid material, which we'll call a sweet water, will have about 10+% sucrose dissolved in it. That is available for direct fermentation, which will be done off the farm, and distillation to give ethanol as a chemical starting material to a process to make, dedicated to making jet fuel. Or it can be concentrated, falling film evaporator, to a syrup, not to a crystal, but to a 67% brick syrup, which is stable and can be stored and shipped conveniently and used as a feed solution for other fermentations, other fed batch fermentations, such as Amyris might run. The other, so we've got to identify some pellet mills that can handle the material coming in and give us the exact specs, but we have to dry it ourselves with waste heat off of the steam explosion equipment, and some equipment vendors or lessors that we can rent equipment from or have fabricated to put on a skid that we can take around and do this work.
So clearly, we have both a ramp from 500,000 to 3 million, 10 million, 50 million gallons as kind of a long-term ramp up, as well as an initial stage. Of course, if we were able to get the contracts between the processors, the growers, and the end users, we could, leap to any one of those stages that we can finance. But on the basic goal, initiating the project, we're hoping to at least do 500 acres. What I would like to do, thank you, David, you did a great job summarizing that. Spike, was there anything else that we missed? You got it? The other thing we'd like to do is, Christina, if you could come down here and just narrate. What we did is we have a little video we'd like to share. He talked to you about the steam explosion process, so be absolutely clear what we're talking about. This is a project that has been run for the last 5 years at USDA ARS to do citrus pulp to ethanol, but I'll pass it to you, Christina.
Okay, so we actually just created a video, and it shows the steam explosion process on our pilot scale system. And this was actually a process that we completed, I think, about 2 weeks ago on sugar beets. And it has captions, so it's not really necessary for me to, I think, add to those captions. I'm gonna let you guys watch it. There's no sound, and you can just see here our technician, Pei Ling, is feeding the sugar beets into the hopper. And then there's a screw in there, and that screw is gonna push that material through into the system. And there is a jet cooker that is actually adding steam to the material, and the material continues on into this holding tube that you see. There's 3 tubes there, and I'm standing sort of behind there. And that is where the material is being held for 1 to 3 minutes with the steam at 50 psi. And then I'm there, and I'm actually controlling the pressure with a back pressure valve, and I'm monitoring the pressure on a digital display. And you can see Randy and our technician, Sandra, and they're taking a look at the computer that is actually logging all of the data. And there's our flash tank, and that's where all the material is collecting. And then it goes from the flash tank through a tube using a pump to where it is collected. And you can see Sandra is here actually collecting the material, and you'll actually get to see what it looks like. It's like a brown applesauce sort of looking material. And it's very hot, that's why it's flowing so well here, but once it gets down to like room temperature, it becomes much thicker, obviously. And there you go.
Thank you, Christine. So that shows the highly labor-intensive and the willingness for Randy and his team and Sandra and Christine to do a lot of hard work. It's been a real labor of love. We really appreciate you stepping up. This is just spontaneous. We would need a product and a solution given Florida's temperature, climate, humidity to stabilize these beets as quickly as we can. So we have a 4 to 8 hour window. One thing we want to clarify, I had some questions that people asked me. How long is this crop? When do you plant it? The beets are planted in October, November, harvested in April, May. They need to be harvested before their feet get wet, before it gets too wet. Then we would have a crop and a half of sorghum, basically, or a crop of corn in rotation. The beet has to be rotated every 3 years because of virus and fungus. That's the rotation. But I just wanted to make clear, several people said, how long can you grow beets? Well, it's basically October 1 to May in Florida. It can be extended, but you run the risk of flood. If it gets below, if the field gets flooded, it's not good for the beet. So with that, I want to thank.
Yeah, can I ask a question? On what the work that you did it in how much? There's always scale issues in all of these things. You want to know that the economics of the process are going to make sense. At least we know we can do it based on your experiment. But as you assess that, what scale, how much of that did you actually do?
About 200 pounds of sugar beets.
Okay. Now, what kind of challenge do you run into when you increase that to get to what is it where our first lot wants to be about then?
Well, let's go back to David. How many tons an acre? I mean, an hour? How many tons an hour?
Well, what we heard is that current harvest equipment can put raw beet out of the ground at 120 to 150 tons an hour. Now, that's fine. If you only run the equipment for half a day and it takes you the rest of the day to catch up, or if you run the equipment for 8 hours and it takes you an additional 5 or 6 to catch up, that's going to be okay. But yeah, we're still talking about high throughput.
Yeah, if we can hear me. One obstacle that we encountered in resizing our beet tissue, we went to perhaps a much smaller size than is absolutely required. And as a result of that, our pumping slowed down, our beet pump. We had to feed it much more slowly than we would citrus peel, just to give the pump a chance to catch it and push it through the system. So there's still some need to appropriately combine your pump, what pump you want to use,
you guys have, from a resource point of view, because we're looking at what the challenges are now and what we need to go and what our shopping list needs to be. So the question is, do you have the wherewithal with what you've been budgeted to scale this up to get the necessary throughput? Okay.
So where we are, Rich, if I may, our group made a determination of what needed to be done, and we basically delegated it to Dave to size the equipment, spec the equipment, estimate the energy use, and estimate the rental cost if we can use existing equipment. So that's our next step, to test that on a 500-acre model so that we can have an answer for both the feed company and the potential offtake agreement on the sugar, because there's a market for sugar. We're estimating 9 cents, the dirty market for sugar, 16 cents a pound internationally, but there's restrictions on exports, so we may not be shipping them out of the country. But there's all those issues, and we're going to address that in the next 60 days.
Well, in the next 60 days, and we need to write up a challenge on that issue.
Right.
Because that's not going to get them the money to run what it needs to run. So we need to identify that as a challenge so that we can be positioned to go work that problem.
I think we did. I think that's what we
Yeah,
talked
and
about.
then, I just remind everybody, including the three of us up here, that, look, we're going at this as an economic development group, okay, a public group. If we were a startup company, we would be building a pilot plant not to make money, but to generate data that would allow us to design the plant that's going to make money, or to make the decision that that plant will not be built. All right, so we are building our pilot plant. We are doing this the output of the pilot plant is going to be good data, economic data, engineering data, and so on. But that's what we're doing here. We're not trying to make money next Monday morning.
Right.
The other thing, Rich, is that one of the things that we said as another step for us was David and I and a few other people were going to get on a call with the feed people and try and assess their requirements and also look at some of the existing plants. There's
the pellet.
Yeah, the pellet requirements would be one step. The other piece was we would go to renewable spirits. They have a 500,000 gallon plant. Could we just use that plant? Could we repurpose an underutilized facility? Could we go to Tropicana? Could we go to Dreyfus facility? There's 4 or 5 potential operating plants at 500,000 gallons or more that we might repurpose. So that's part of our 60-day action steps.
Okay. And this gets more into the if you need public resources, we need to tee up what the issue is, kind of structure out what we need, whether it be in the ARS budget or whether it be something for a value-added grant proposal to you share. We need to be able to identify that, and hopefully that's the path you're on in 60 days here.
That's the goal.
Tee that up. So that'll
We may be able to
something we
get
can
some of that.
discuss in great depth.
Hopefully David and I can put our heads together before next week and do
Yeah,
at least a
and-
first sketch so that when we get up to DC, we can there may be sources for support in that area.
Yeah, and that could either be, could be ARS, could be NEFA, potentially, I would think. Randy?
There was one proposal that's been submitted. I don't know when review panel is going to be meeting for that, what the results of that will be.
I mean, our.
We already did. We've done 2 grant
We did.
applications.
Okay.
We
that
did
one-
2. We did 2.
But that wasn't the equipment plan, it was the equipment plan.
That was more for the crop itself.
Yeah, and process development.
Yeah, so there may be, we'll have to see what that window looks like, but doing what's appropriate in that area may be the key ingredient here for the value-added approach next year. So we'll keep that. We got a bunch of tools in the toolkit. They aren't going away with the presidential election. We just need to be very focused on what we want and have the right kind of advocacy. We can get there, just like we got here with this
Right.
program.
Is there anything else in our group that we missed? One point that was raised was we need to have an energy budget to make sure it doesn't affect the wind, and that's what David mentioned earlier, so that was a priority. So I think we covered it. So we have a good list of, maybe it's 9 or 10 challenges and
Yeah, we just got
pathways.
the two we got to add, the one Dave brought up and this one relative to the processing.
Or the use of alternative facilities, so,
Well, it is a problem, a challenge, the pelletizing, but thinking as one coming from upstate New York, where there's failing pulp mills around, and there's a huge interest in repurposing assets that are in the ground to save local jobs. So if there's a pellet mill that's underutilized or in danger of being shuttered, repurposing that pellet mill is, yeah, sure, it's a challenge. It's work that's got to be done. But there may be a tremendous upside to that too, keeping a local facility opening and using assets that are already sunk cost.
Are there any wood pellet mills in Florida?
Well, I don't think we need a wood pellet mill. I mean, I'm talking about a citrus mill that's not got any more citrus.
Citrus mill.
okay. So with that, questions?
No, I was in some discussion about the crop insurance and.
Oh, yes.
And looking towards that.
Yep, that's on the list. Sorry, thank you very much.
Yes. So we would work with the Farm Service Agency here in the state of Florida. Brian and Amy and I are going to meet, get on a conference call, and
That's FSA.
FSA, USDA FSA,
Right, and
crop
that's-
insurance. It's called non-crop insurance or something.
Right, right. Who was the person that helped us out there on the staff there? Who was the person? Yeah, we had a person was very helpful there. So I think FSA we got to.
So we need to follow. That's another challenge that we have in front of us.
Okay.
Thanks, Brian. Anything else? With that, I want to thank everybody. It's been a long, hard day. Give yourself another round of applause for hanging in there. And we'll be working these notes, getting these reports together. The FTP site will have all the materials that we have here. We'll also have a YouTube site for the presentations. And anything else that we missed, give me an email and drop me an email, and we'll be looking forward. Probably our next meeting will be late January, early February to wrap it up, and that'll be our final meeting on this stage of the study. Thank you.
All right. So we got out of it what we wanted to get out of it.